Well, hello there. Today we'll be reading part 1, chapter 1 of Fred Anderson's Crucible of War. So, summary of part 1, the origin of the 7 Years' War, 1450 to 1754. The Iroquois League, the Ohio Valley, the stability of balance of power in 18th century North America, the Anglo-French Wars, the penetration of British traders and speculators into the Ohio country, and the ominous convergence of British and French empires. George Washington steps inauspiciously onto the stage of history. European politics and the beginnings of the diplomatic revolution. Chapter 1. Iroquois and Empire, 1450 to 1735. Wars between France and England, or after the Act of Union in 1707, Great Britain, dominated European politics between 1689 and 1815. The first three of these began in Europe and centered on dynastic issues, which member of the royal family would become the Elector Palatine, or the King of Spain, or the Emperor King, or Emperor Queen, of Austria. Each had its North American counterpart, called by the Anglo-Americans King William's, Queen Anne's, and King George's Wars, respectively. And all of them were in one way or another important to the colonists of England and France. To European statesmen, however, the fighting in the New World was so much sideshow. Europe, its balance, and its monarchies were what mattered. Thus, the first three wars were typical European conflicts of the 18th century, limited, bloody, expensive, indecisive affairs that ended not in great conquest, but the belligerents, mutual exhaustion, and a restoration of the balance of power. The Fourth Anglo-French War, however, broke the mold. The 7 Years' War was about the control of territory, not thrones. It created a seismic shift in Europe's alliance system and balance of power, and its first shots were not European, but an American frontier. That the greatest of Europe's 18th century wars could have begun in the Pennsylvania backcountry reflected the growing importance of America in the diplomatic, military, and economic calculations of European governments. That it spread as it did from the New World to the Old resulted from the maneuverings of European diplomats who, seeking advantage, destroyed the fragile balance of power established by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 at the end of the previous war. But what made the fighting begin, where it did, and when it did, were circumstances specific to America, conditions at best imperfectly grasped by European statesmen. For 1754 marked the end of prolonged collapse of a half-century-old strategic balance in eastern North America, a tripartite equilibrium in which the Iroquois Confederacy occupied a crucial position, both geographically and diplomatically, between the French and English colonial empires. Through the first half of the century, the competition between empires in North America had been rendered inconclusive because the Iroquois maintained independence of action, and thus a large measure of influence over affairs on the borderlands. The story of the last Anglo-French colonial war begins, therefore not with Britain or France, nor even with the American colonies, but with the 6 nations of the Iroquois, and indeed a single chief, Tenagahirsson. Why should a man born in Catawba, reared as a Seneca, acting as a spokesman for the Iroquois Confederacy in the Ohio Valley, choose to smash open the skull of a Frenchman who is neither his enemy nor an enemy to his people? To unravel this mystery, we must begin far from the place and time of Tenagahirsson's act, in the area that would one day become upstate New York, before the first Europeans arrived on the shores of North America. For it was there that the Iroquois nations made their home, and there that their unique religious and cultural system arose, one dedicated to ending warfare among themselves by directing aggression toward other peoples in the name of peace. The Great League of Peace and Power, a ritual and cultural association that loosely united the original 5 nations of the Iroquois, the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Nanangas, and the Cayugas, and the Senecas. was perhaps 3 centuries old when Tanagi Hirsen washed his hands on the ensign Jumonville's brain. The cultural bonds fostered within the Great League had served as the basis for much newer political union known as the Iroquois Confederacy, which emerged among the Five Nations in response to the European invasion of the 17th century. Although the ritual function of the Great League and diplomatic, political, and military function of the Confederacy sometimes overlapped, they generally all serve separate and complementary ends. The Great League to perpetuate peace among its member nations, and the Confederacy to deal with European colonists and with Indian societies outside the League. The Great League of Peace and Power originated, according to Iroquois tradition, in an ancient period when the Five Nations were locked in perpetual blood feuding. Ethnographers have identified this mythological era with a larger Aboriginal culture pattern of mourning war, in which the families of people killed in raids can grieve properly for their loved ones by replacing them, spiritually as well as physically, with captives taken from the enemy's community. These captives might be either permanently adopted into the bereaved family as a substitute for its lost member, or ritually skinned and slain to compensate for the family's loss. Mourning warfare could evolve into a closed system of raids, kidnapping, suffering, death, and grief. Such misery, the Iroquois believed, had been the lot of the Five Nations before the good news of peace and power was revealed to them by supernatural being, Taganawida, who showed them ritual forms of condolence and gift-giving by which they could cope with bereavement without resort to war. To perpetuate Daganawida's gospel rituals, and with them peace among the nations, the heads of all these clans in the Five Nations formed a grand council beneath the tree of great peace at the settlement of Onondaga, which thereafter became the symbolic center of Iroquois life. Because all people might find shelter beneath the tree of great peace, the Five Nations took it as their duty to spread the gospel by allying themselves with Indian groups and taking weaker nations under their protection as dependents. People who refused to heed the good news as allies or dependents, however, could only be dealt with as enemies. The Iroquois believed that war against such recalcitrant nations was not only just but necessary, because conquest and forcible subjection to the Great League offered the only remaining way that they too could find the path to peace. For perhaps 2 centuries before the Iroquois came to sustained contact with European colonists, their commitment to proposing the good news of peace helps sustain almost continuous hostilities with peoples beyond the Great League and its growing penumbra of clients and allies. The appearance of European traders and settlers on the margins of the Iroquois in the 17th century confronted the Five Nations with grave, unprecedented threats in the form of desirable trade goods, devastating diseases, and even more destructive warfare. The willingness of Dutch traders to exchange muskets for pelts made Iroquois warriors the most feared in eastern North America, while the losses the Iroquois war parties suffered generated an increasing demand for captives. In a half-century-long exacerbation of mourning war, the Five Nations gained a legendary reputation for ferocity, conquering and dispersing Indian groups such as the Hurons, Eries, and Neutrals on either side of the Great Lakes and emptying the Ohio Valley of its Monongahela, Shawnee, and other residents. But the fabulous military successes of the Iroquois exacted a formidable price, for by the 1660s they found themselves so exhausted and their population so heavily diluted by adoptees, they were unable to continue the fight. When the English conquest of New Netherland ended, the flow of Dutch arms and ammunition in 1664, the Iroquois could no longer continue. In 1665 to 1667, each of the Five Nations made its peace with New France, the principal arms supplier and trading partner of their enemies, and the tide of conflict ebbed. During these long, terrible years of bloodshed, the ancient ceremonial institution of the Grand Council had begun to take on new functions as the war chiefs of the Five Nations made it a forum for concerting policies to serve their people's mutual interests. Never before had the war leaders, a group of vigorous younger men, distinct from the older civil chiefs or sachems, who still performed the Great League's necessary rituals, achieved so much cooperation. In the War Chiefs Council lay the origin of the Iroquois Confederacy as the diplomatic organization able to coordinate the policies of the various nations. The Confederacy's concentration on external relations complemented the internally unifying peacekeeping role of the Great League. Eventually, the Confederacy evolved a sophisticated diplomatic system based on the gift-giving practices and condolence ceremonies of the League. Peace allowed the Iroquois to recover and measure demographic stability, but brought new challenges as the French Jesuit missionaries began to evangelize among them, dividing each of the 5 nations internally. The Mohawks, in particular, suffered losses as the converts relocated along the St. Lawrence River. The secession of the Catholic Caughnawagas, so called from the name of their biggest settlement, was the most dramatic instance of factionalization, but all 5 of the nations split internally into Francophile, Neutralist, and Anglophile wings. Within the Confederacy Council, the Anglophiles gained the upper hand, and in 1677 created a commercial and strategic alliance, the Covenant Chain, with the government of New York, and subsequently with colonies from Virginia to New England. English encouragement and weapons allowed the Confederacy in the last quarter of the century to inaugurate an aggressive policy aimed at penetrating the French trading and alliance systems that spread over the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley regions. The result almost inevitably was a renewal of the earlier pattern of warfare, which after 1689 merged with the first Anglo-French colonial conflict, King William's War. Onondaga's alliance with the English now proved disastrous, for during the interval of peace, the French had created a highly effective system of alliances with Algonquin-speaking refugee groups whom Iroquois warriors had driven far to the west, beyond Lake Michigan, in the first half of the century. The key to this French alliance system was the ability of missionaries, traders, and officers to assume the cultural role of father, as understood among the Indians of the upper Great Lakes Basin, or Pays d'en Haut. Because Algonquin fathers did not discipline their children, but sought to create harmony, the real power stemmed from the ability to give gifts and mediate disputes. Fathers might persuade, but could not seek to exert direct control without forfeiting their moral authority. French mediators functioned in just this way among the fragmented, often mutually hostile refugee peoples of the Pays d'en Haut. Groups that shared a little but a common history of enmity with the Iroquois under the guiding influence of Onontio, as the Algonquins called the French governor-general, and by extension the king he represented, as well as the priests, traders, and military officers who represented him among the Indians. The refugee villages gradually coalesced into an alliance system centered on the French power, French diplomatic gifts, trade relationships, emphasizing mutuality rather than competition. The French arms and military aid thus became the currency of power for the chiefs who led the refugee groups. Thus, as the Iroquois tightened their bonds with the English in the Covenant Chain, Onontio created a highly effective counterweight to their power. Whereas the comparatively united 5 nations had generally enjoyed the advantage over their disunited enemies earlier in the century, the renewal of hostilities brought defeat after defeat and carried the war in the very heart of the Iroquois. Faced with the realization that the English were incompetent military allies, war chiefs representing Anglophile, Francophile, and Neutralist factions contended for control of policy until the Confederacy nearly fell to pieces. Finally, the headmen of the various factions hammered out an internal truce that enabled Iroquois diplomats to conclude a peace treaty with the French at Montreal and simultaneously to renew the Covenant Chain with the English at Albany. These agreements, known as the Grand Settlement of 1701, preserved the 5 nations' independence and inaugurated a new era of neutrality in Iroquois diplomacy. As factionalism gradually subsided in the Grand Council, the fragile agreement to stand aloof from Anglo-French disputes grew into a robust consensus that everything could be gained by playing off one European group against the other, preventing either from gaining preeminence. Iroquois neutrality thus became both the basis of stability, within the League and the source of power to influence relations between the contending empires. Neutrality meant neither passivity nor pacifism to the Five Nations, but rather the pursuit of three complementary activist policies. Hostility toward Indian peoples far to the south, especially the Cherokees and the Catawbas of South Carolina. Cooperation with the government of Pennsylvania to gain control over Indian peoples and land on the southern flank of Iroquois, and peace with the Fur Indians, or the French allied Algonquins of the Pays de Haunt and upper Mississippi Valley. The first of these three policies allowed young Iroquois men to fulfill their culturally sanctioned role as warriors and permitted population replacement to continue by the limited practice of morning war. It was through a raid on the Catawbas, for example, that the boy Tanaga Hirson of the Seneca Nation, and his mother were taken captive, eventually to be adopted as members of the Seneca Nation. The second policy served two practical ends. By cooperating with the government of Pennsylvania, later Virginia, the Iroquois lowered the risk of attacking the southern Indians, the settlements of two client peoples in the Pennsylvania Susquehanna Valley, and the Shawnees and the Delawares, acted as a barrier against Catawba and Cherokee raiders from the south, and served as the way stations at which Iroquois warriors traversing their territory could be reprovisioned. Furthermore, once Pennsylvania and Virginia recognized Iroquois diplomats as spokesmen for the Delawares and Shawnees, the Iroquois could dispose of those clients and the lands on which they lived as they pleased. The third policy of maintaining peaceful relations with the Far Indians also served a dual purpose. For it preserved the Iroquois heartland from the attacks of French allied enemies, even as it magnified the importance of the Iroquois to the English, both as diplomats and as trading middlemen. Only through Iroquois mediators could the English communicate with peoples deep in the interior. Only through the Iroquois could the Far Indians acquire English trade goods. Thus, all three policies obviously and directly benefited the Iroquois. But the central principle that actuated them all was Onondaga's ability to maneuver between French and British. The Iroquois chiefs' aggressive neutrality enabled them to manipulate both French and British imperial authorities, representing themselves as spokesmen for the Far Indians, acting on behalf of previously conquered dependent peoples such as the Delawares and Shawnees, and maintaining that they were the rightful landlords of vast western territories. The Iroquois seized and for a half-century maintained the diplomatic initiative within North America. Particularly in dealing with the British, most significantly, they were able to use these taxes to claim suzerainty over the Ohio country, a region that for a long time lay beyond the reach of either the French or the British, but which was nonetheless a zone of great strategic importance to both. France needed access to the Ohio River and its northern tributaries because this river complex offered the only efficient inland passage between their settlements in Canada and those in mid-Mississippi Valley, in the region called the Illinois country. The Illinois settlements had grown up along the Mississippi between the confluences of the Missouri and the Kaskaskia rivers at the beginning of the 18th century, when the wide-ranging fur traders called Conreurs de Bois had founded villages without bothering first to obtain permission from New France. These villages prospered as centers of farming, fur trading, and eventually lead mining. By the 1710s, they were provisioning the new colony of Louisiana at the mouth of the Mississippi. French colonial administrators soon recognized the importance of the Illinois country as the vertex of an arc of settlement and Indian alliances sweeping from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the Mississippi Delta. Because this strategic system would restrict the demographically expansive British colonies to the area east of the Appalachians by denying them access to the rivers that permitted trade and travel through the interior of the continent, it held out the promise of rewards beyond America alone. Once the encirclement was complete, French diplomats reasoned the British would have to divert so much naval and military strength to protect their colonies they would be hobbled in Europe. It was thus vital to France that Britain be excluded from the Ohio country, so long as their traders, priests, and soldiers enjoyed unimpeded travel through it. The French did not need to control the Ohio Valley directly. Indeed, because the expansive physical occupation might well prove insupportable. French policymakers preferred to see it remain under neutral Indian control, provided that the valley's Indians traded with France. The British feared a French cordon to the west as much as the French desired it. British imperial officials dreaded the prospect of burgeoning colonial population indefinitely confined to the lands between the Appalachian Barrier and the Atlantic, where demographic growth would inevitably drive down wages to the point that Americans would compete with British manufacturers rather than consuming their wares. Nor did His Majesty's government relish the station of expensive army and navy detachment in America as bulwarks against French aggression. British colonists themselves saw the Ohio country mainly as a vast realm for future settlement, the more so since two vigorous provinces, Virginia and Pennsylvania, claimed that Ohio lands fell within their territorial limits. Until the middle of the 18th century, however, the impossibility of exercising direct control over so vast and remote a region mooted the prospect of Anglo-American colonization west of the Appalachians. The Ohio country accordingly became an area within which the British sought to exercise indirect influence against the day when they might finally colonize it. Until then, it was imperative that the French be prevented from gaining control over the region and its waterways. The Iroquois were only too happy to turn the geopolitical anxieties of Britain and France to their own advantage. This they did by insisting that the Ohio country was theirs, by right of conquest, a claim for which the wars of the first half of the 17th century provided a plausible basis. Following the depopulation of the Ohio country, the westernmost Iroquois nation, the Senecas, used the upper Ohio drainage as a vast hunting ground. Eventually, western Senecas known as Mingos set up permanent residence in the area between Lake Erie and the Allegheny River. Moreover, from the late 1720s onward, the Ohio Valley proper was being settled by Iroquois dependents, bands of Shawnees and Delawares moving west from Pennsylvania under growing pressure from European immigration into the Susquehanna Valley. Onondaga designated resident Iroquois village headsmen as its representatives on the Ohio and authorized them to speak for the local dependent peoples as well as the Mingos. These representatives, known as half-kings, had the power to negotiate and receive diplomatic gifts, but they could not make binding treaties with Onondaga's assent. Tanagahirson, the adopted Seneca who was living as village headman at Logstown, on the site of modern Ambridge, Pennsylvania, as early in 1747, was one such half-king, and Oneida chief named Scarati was another, acting as regent over the Ohio Shawnees. In reality, Iroquois control over the Ohio country rested entirely on the degree to which the Mingo, Shawnee, and Delaware residents were willing to cooperate with the half-kings, and thus on the willingness of Tanagahirson and Scarati, whose authority depended on their ability to retain local followings, to follow policies determined at distant Onondaga. Despite the tenaciousness of their real influence, the Grand Council's chiefs were able to take the carefully constructed illusion of control and use it to play off the British and French against one another in the great game of North American imperial politics. By controlling, or seeming to control, the Ohio country, Onondaga made itself the fulcrum upon which relations between the French and British achieved their delicate balance that lasted for the first half of the 18th century. By shifting, or threatening to shift, its position to favor one side or the other, the Confederacy compelled the French and the British to bid for its friendship, or at least it continued non-alignment. The British, lacking effective connections with any northern Indians other than the Iroquois, were particularly susceptible to the Confederacy's claim to control vast numbers of warriors through its alliances with the Far Indians. At a time when all Iroquois held only about 1,100 warriors, for example, and when the Shawnee and Delawares in the Ohio Valley counted perhaps 350 warriors between them, the most knowledgeable of Pennsylvania's Indian experts reported that the Iroquois could command the allegiance of 9,300 fighters among the Far Indians. To secure Onondaga's cooperation, both the French and the British strove to maintain friendly diplomatic relations on the Confederacy's terms by the giving of gifts. Gift-giving in the form of ritual presentation of strings or belts of wampum beads had been a part of the ceremonies of the Great League since time immemorial. Wampum, A sacred medium was necessary to reinforce and ratify the words spoken in council. Beaded strings and belts also formed the ritual centerpiece of intercultural negotiations between the Iroquois and Europeans. But as time passed, trade goods greatly supplemented these ritual gifts. By the middle 18th century, the conclusion of treaty negotiations could entail the delivery of a ton or more of European goods, including clothes, tools, firearm, ironware, ammunition, and liquor. Such gifts brightened the chain of friendship, providing manufacturers and consumable commodities to peoples who would have found it hard to survive without them, and supplying the medium of trade by which Iroquois middlemen could obtain high-quality beaver pelts from the groups north of the Great Lakes. The Confederacy therefore used its strategic value to make up for its lack of direct access to the marketable furs, as well as to help preserve control over its own affairs and lands. For the 18th century Iroquois, then, everything depended on the ability to maneuver between the two European colonies to avoid becoming dependent on either. In Queen Anne's War, from 1701 to 1713, this meant negotiating frequently with both Montreal and Albany, assuring that both sides of their goodwill and cooperativeness, but avoiding entanglement in the fighting whenever possible. When it became impossible, as it sometimes did, to deny the demands of the British for military aid, the Iroquois chose one or two prudent paths. In 1709, they cooperated minimally and delayed a planned invasion of Canada until it had been aborted. In 1711, they showed untenable enthusiasm for another expedition, while quietly sending word of what was afoot to the French. Thus, they thwarted the second invasion as effectively as the first. During the 30 years of peace that followed the end of Queen Anne's War, Onondaga's diplomats met regularly with both French and British officials, maintaining trading relations with both and allowing the Europeans to brighten the chain of friendship with gifts. Between 1713 and 1744, while peace endured between empires, the Iroquois gained strength by admitting the Tuscaroras to the Great League as a sixth nation, enhanced their formal claim to the high country by sanctioning the settlement of Mingos, Shawnees, and Delawares in the Upper Valley, extended the scope of their direct relations with British colonies beyond New York and Pennsylvania. Ironically, the very growth of Onondaga's self-assurance would cause the Confederacy its ability to maneuver between the rival empires, and the end of the era of Iroquois neutrality. Although no one at the time saw it clearly, the events that seemingly marked the zenith of the Great League's influence would prove to have been the harbinger of its long decline, a change of fortune that owed as much to the Iroquois hubris and greed as to the growth of European power. Well, we're done with Chapter 1, Part 1 of Fred Anderson's Crucible of War. I have to see you next time, where we'll be reading Chapter 2. See you next time.